Okay, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Jamee Fiore is an architectural historian with the Kansas Historical Society. She manages the National and State Registers of Historic Places and the Architectural Survey Program for the state of Kansas. She has been with the agency for just over 3 years and held the same job previously with the Idaho State Historical Society in Boise, Idaho. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jamee, who will present on Route 66 in Kansas. Thank you. Go ahead, Jamee.
Thank you. Are you seeing my notes or the slide?
No, we're seeing the slides, no notes.
Okay. Good evening. So we're going to talk about roadside architecture and history in Kansas. We have a lot of great photos for you to stare at while I tell you a story. So over a century, from 1800 to 1900, the concept of travel and distance was radically and significantly changed. In 1812, it took an average of 6 days to travel by stagecoach across the rugged mountain barriers from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. 40 years later, the same trip could be made by train in 16 hours. And by the end of the century, the entire run took a single morning. Between 1900 and 1920, the US went from 8,000 cars to 8 million automobiles owned. In the 1930s, a movement for the interstate highway system began, as well as safety for its travelers. Automobile-related businesses started appearing at the turn of the century, and the car slowly turned from a luxury that the wealthy could afford to a more practical necessity that would allow people to travel to their destinations on their own schedule. By the 1930s, Americans owned 23 million automobiles. The need for better roads and connectivity became a focus.
Sorry, Jamee, I just cut you off. Please unmute yourself. Sorry.
No problem.
There you go. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. By the 1930s, Americans owned 23 million automobiles. The need for better roads and connectivity became a focus of many politicians, and that influenced a drastic change in our landscape across the country. With better roads and citizens controlling their own travel plans, the idea of vacationing and tourism became really prominent, and it pushed Americans to go out on the road. So the increase of a more mobile traveler shifted the way cities and communities were built. Commercial cores began to leave typical main streets and extend to what they called a miracle mile. And that became a corridor lined with an array of signs, buildings, parking lots, all designed to catch the eye. As roads transitioned to more safe and permanent fixtures of the landscape, the softer pneumatic tires were developed for trucks, and the use for transporting goods became more efficient and economical, so much so that it would challenge the use of trains for transport and distribution. The use of trains for transporting people was also challenged by the car and the bus system. Public transit developed and would make it more convenient and comfortable to travel through the area. It also could provide more reasonable access to communities than a train could. You'd be able to go to a specific space instead of just a stop. With $189 million to build over 10,000 miles of federal aid roads, the Federal Highway Act of 1921 brought a new way of development across the country. The Lincoln Highway was one of the prominent historic roadways, and the Lincoln Highway Association was a private regional association that influenced the network of roads.
Just 1 second, Jamee, sorry, we're getting interference. I'm going to mute everybody and then you please unmute yourself. 1 second, please. Okay, Jamee, go ahead. Please unmute yourself. Oh, probably mute myself.
Got it.
Okay, you back? Good.
Yes.
Great.
Okay.
Wonderful. Sorry about that.
That's fine. The Lincoln Highway Association was a private regional association that influenced the network of roads as well as the manufacturers of the auto industry. So at this time, the signage we're now familiar with in the US, the shield shape and naming systems was established. Federal highways numbers major routes end with 0 or 5, and east to west routes are even numbered. So the New Deal era programs began, and some of the roadways benefited from the programs. However, by World War II, it was clear that many issues were still remaining with the highway system. Slowly, development patterns of communities shifted to the use of the automobile, especially following World War II. The standard idea of housing and family coincided with the creation of subdivisions, fenced-in yards, and wide streets that kids were able to play on outdoors. Returning veterans and a bump in the economy established a more disposable incomes for families to enjoy vacations and to travel. And roadside service stations became a staple along thoroughfares and highways with motels and drive-ins. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, which provided $25 billion over 10 years to construct 41,000 miles of highway. I really like this photo a lot, but roads were typically assigned to maintenance and management through local governments, and that was the case in Kansas as well. One of the earliest groups to push for better roads in Kansas was the League of American Wheelmen in 1890, and this is a photo of one of those groups. And other cyclist organizations began fighting for better roads across the country, and other groups joined in, such as postal workers and other auto enthusiasts. The Kansas Good Roads Association was formed in 1900 with the slogan, "Keep Kansans out of the mud," in pursuit of better quality roads. Larger counties were able to hire an engineer that would supervise roads and bridges in the area. In 1900, Kansas had 220 cars statewide, and by 1910, there were 10,500 cars. In 1912, there were 30,000 cars. In order to keep up with the demands of tourists, Kansas needed to establish an interconnected roadway. Associations, town boosters, and the like began promoting highway connectivity. US Highway 50 reached from Hutchinson to Reno counties to the Colorado border. And that was one of the early roadways. Shortly after, it connected to Kansas City and was dubbed the New Santa Fe Trail. And hopefully most of you know Kansas is a great thoroughfare state. So we have many, many trails that cross our areas. So 7 important highway crossings went through Kansas, including the Golden Belt Road, which was from Kansas City to Colorado Springs by way of Junction City and Salina, the Meriden Road, which is known as Highway 81, Sunflower Route, which connected the Omaha-Denver Highway, and the Rock Island Highway is now US 36. Guidebooks full of advertisements, lodging, food, and mechanics and maps were made available for motorists. While driving your automobile, there was a need for that on-the-go maintenance, and service stations slowly evolved to include other things like auto parts, oil, tune-ups, tools, and gas. Due to the escalating number of motorists and improvements in the road system, the State Highway Department was unable to stop construction in the rights of way. So billboards, lunch counters, gas stations, and repair shops began taking over all of the thoroughfares. After World War II, Americans used their new wealth to travel. So oil and gas companies worked hard to define their corporate identity and brand that would encourage travelers to stop at their stations. So postcards were a popular way to send notes before cards, but that changed with the boost in automobile use to kind of support your own town and boast about your own advertisements and attractions. The Kansas Turnpike Authority was established in 1953. By 1956, the 9,500 miles of roads in Kansas included 702 miles of interstate highway and 8,800 miles of federal aid roads. From 1957 to 1970, the interstate system expanded, but Kansas maintained a grand rural road network to connect the urban communities to the non-urban communities. There's a lot of smaller towns, rural populations, and farmland in Kansas. During the 1920s and 30s, domestic styles of architecture were used for service stations. So the domestic style were familiar and welcoming to people who were just now starting to travel to different communities on their own. And so in the 1940s, the buildings transitioned into an Art Deco and modern design with an emphasis on eye-catching signage. Gas stations began as domestic designs such as sheds or cottages, and then the addition of canopies and bays, and finally the box design evolved. After World War II, commercial strips began popping up with flamboyant structures and angular designs that appealed to travelers. More change occurred through the cultural transition of the space age, which influenced the design of roadside architecture dramatically. New space age stations consisted of flared roof lines with vertical pylons and were common devices used by larger corporations to identify their brand and display company logos. In the 1960s, Lady Bird Johnson requested that service stations participate in the Highway Beautification Act, which had service stations and roadside architecture become more connected to the American landscape. After the Highway Beautification Act of 1965, environmental and domestic design stopped using wood shingles and mansard roofs. And by the 1960s, the roadside places were more likely to blend into the landscape and be less of an attraction. Post-World War II service stations often included curb cuts, gas pumps, pump islands, driveways, parking areas, and service areas, as well as signs, canopies, and overhead garage doors. They became quite complex. So now we'll kind of look at different varieties of roadside architecture, and most of the photos I'm using are from Kansas, but there are some that are not. Kansas has a huge variety of roadside architecture. It's really interesting. But so service stations. These stations were set back slightly and paved to allow for automobile traffic to easily and quickly enter the station. The V-shaped hyperbolic paraboloid and batwing designs were a visual cue to passersby that the station was ahead and they would receive consistent quality and service. There's also a reference to corporate branding and identity that came about at this time. Paved fuel pump islands were covered by the projecting canopies that extended over the main building, which housed the salesman's office, restrooms for the customers, and service bays for needed repairs and maintenance. Could you imagine traveling without restrooms? No. The idea of symbolism, logos, and corporate development evolved after World War II, and the gas station became a focal point. So the post-war design aesthetics changed with the rise of new abstract designs and styles from iconic artists and designers. This directly influenced the way companies approach their product lines and marketing. All of the Phillips 66 service stations included standard elements like 2 restrooms, a storage space, a salesman office. With the investment in the interstate highway system, Phillips planned to expand its reach and create a new breed of service station that would focus on the meeting customer travel needs. So auto dealers are another roadside attraction. So as the popularity and accessibility of the automobile increased, the need for convenient maintenance and repair became very important. At the beginning, buildings were adapted to fit the needs of repair shops, but soon new buildings were designed and constructed specifically for servicing and displaying vehicles. These purpose-built designs were essential for the auto industry because they needed to expel gas fumes, handle fires, and provide ventilation, which were fundamental to the safety of the operation. The development of dealerships was an important element for automakers as they needed a way to distribute their goods and products away from their manufacturing sites. In exchange for selling rights, the dealer would provide appropriate sales and services with proper signage, spare parts, and repair. Diners, luncheon, and restaurants became a go-to option for travelers, and these buildings evolved to look like an attractive roadside venture. So roadside stands were an early choice and one that still remains common across the country. I'm sure you've driven past many and stopped by to get some kind of peach cobbler or something. Beginning more as a small setup with access to produce, these evolved to take place and house souvenirs, cold drinks, ice cream, sandwiches, postcards, or some kind of bite to eat. These places had to become less of an unflattering stand and more of an attractive business in order to maintain the interest of travelers and offer good quality food and stops. The roadside diner evolved from the railroad dining car and urban lunch wagons, making home-cooked meals more accessible to the working class. These smaller establishments survived the Great Depression as they were much needed to maintain with minimal overhead and inexpensive meals. By 1932, around 4,000 modular lunchrooms operated in the US. The Valentine Diner was made by the Valentine Manufacturing Company from 1938 to 1974. Arthur and Ella Valentine opened a small restaurant in Hazleton, Kansas in the late 1920s. And Valentine worked for the Wichita-based Abla Hotel Supply Company, which had created the Little Palace or the White Crown lunchrooms. Valentine diners were boxy, small, brightly colored enamel exteriors with flying buttresses on the corners and pylon signs. Two things were assumed about these structures: that the size was small enough to make a reasonable living and that they would be ideal for a chain operation. So around 2,200 Valentines were built in the US. In the 1930s, they used stainless steel, formica, and glass blocks to evoke a streamlined, modern design. And the stainless steel and enamel were the most colorful and the eye-catching options. After World War II, the split diner was developed, which could be built in a couple of sections and then easily shipped somewhere. This led to giant roadside diners of the post-war era, but the 1950s diners had to accommodate the larger number of families that were eating out instead of eating at home. So this little diner you can see has the buttresses on the sides of the building. Roadside diners were outpaced by the newer and more modern fast food restaurants, and the stainless steel diner tried to keep up by changing to a more traditional design. But soon after, the diner became a fad and staple of roadside history. So restaurants, coffee shops, and cafes. These family-style restaurants were connected with motor courts and gas stations for one-stop shops, which were more suitable for a traveling family. And Howard Johnson began as a pharmacy and soda fountain, but survived the Great Depression to eventually own 130 locations through their franchise agreement, becoming a motor lodge and restaurant. Roadside coffee shops were sleek and modern and eventually led to places like Denny's and other larger restaurant chains. One iconic roadside business is the drive-in restaurant, known for their canopy parking, their enclosed kitchens, and a car hop station. Around 33,500 drive-ins were in extant in 1964. This is the Hanover Pancake House sign in Kansas and restaurant. The Vista Hamburgers and Bobo's Drive-In in Topeka. It's now brightly colored like blue and orange and something else. And this is 1106 Drive-In. So fast food restaurants, White Castle and White Tower were the earliest fast food chains beginning in the 1920s. They were made to be clean and consistent, serving the same menu and using the same recipes, and they had the same designed building. Much like branding identities today, the building alerted passerbys to the chain. So there was a big issue with sanitation concerns regarding roadside stands, and these chain restaurants were able to get rid of that stigma associated with roadside food. So the carryout trade could provide smaller seating spaces and allow for more feasible structures. Walter Anderson of Wichita developed and produced lines of hamburgers and created White Castle, which expanded from Wichita to 12 other major cities in the eastern states. The appearance of the employees, use of stainless steel and enameled metal promoted clean lines and cleanliness and sanitary conditions. McDonald's expanded on this idea and evolved the assembly line technique to pare down their menu, and which allowed them to sell over 1 million burgers and shakes and 160 tons of French fries. The fast food franchises led to more companies in the 1950s, like Burger King and Kentucky Fried Chicken. So if you're going on the road, you're going to need a place to stay, probably. So now we'll look at some lodging options. Hotels were primarily found in urban settings and had little to no available parking. People who traveled by automobile needed inexpensive overnight conveniences located along the corridors they were driving on. So cabin courts, cottage courts, motor inns, and motels developed beginning in the 1920s. Auto camps were designated campgrounds available for motorists and worked well with transients and travelers. These were more popular in Western states as urban centers were much further apart and destinations required more stops in remote areas. City-sponsored camps were located near commercial areas where travelers could easily find gas stations, garages, repair shops, food, and the post office. So camps usually had kitchens, tables, fireplaces, showers, baths, restrooms, and they were well equipped for travelers. By 1923, Kansas has the most automobile campgrounds with places in 156 communities. Over 5,880 tourists from 43 states, Canada, and Mexico visited the McPherson campground, generating income more than the $7,000 it cost to build the facilities. By 1928, this phase of lodging had ended because local governments stopped taking on that responsibility to ease city liabilities. So cabin courts were groupings of small cabins typically built near a gas station or restaurant or at an overlook and were usually privately owned. Someone may have had an extra land or such and would use the building, use that space to build these courts and make profit off of them. So these were one-stop shops and could take on an unkempt appearance after a few seasons because they weren't made to be permanent or glamorous housing. More so, it was just a quick resting place. These facilities often had indoor plumbing and heat as they evolved to be more accommodating for travelers, and they were referred to as cottages, so that way they would evoke a more welcoming environment, and they look like little houses. So cottages were winterized for year-round access and had private bathrooms and closets, and some even had kitchenettes. Frank McDonald, the athletic director of Haskell Indian Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, created the Indian Village, which was a complex housing and a gas station and cabins that were shaped like teepees, and a dance room restaurant, which opened in 1930. So this design generated publicly in multiple places, and 22 other Indian villages or lookalikes were constructed across the country. I think the movie Cars has something similar to this, or they were cones with something like that. So they became an iconic roadside stop as well. Here's some other pictures. It's still in extant and used today. Motels. The term motel was coined by Arthur Heinemann, who began designing bungalow-style cottages in 1910. A hotel owner hired the architect to work on large-scale motor courts and the Spanish Mission style to hold up to 160 lodgers. Motels started taking hold in the 1930s and gained more presence two decades following World War II to accommodate the large number of travelers going across the nation. By 1964, 61,000 motels were across the country and included guest rooms with furniture, bedding, stationery, and soap. So this is a historic and current photo of this motel and cafe. Referral chains developed out of the mom and pop motel. The establishments would use a single name, logo, and common standards to encourage repeat customers. The Best Western is a well-known example of this referral chain type. Howard Johnson understood the use of franchising through its popular restaurant chain and expanded their properties to include an adjacent motel, therefore building upon their brand. Corporations began creating standard designs, service, advertising, and management. The Sheraton and Marriott were some of these. Motels changed into 2 stories and expanded office and front desk, not an official lobby like a hotel. Improved climate control and double-loaded corridors. So using architecture and signage is a form of advertising. It was a great branding tool for companies to attract motorists with consistent standards of service. So I think of McDonald's, as soon as you see the golden arches, you know exactly what to expect and what you're getting. So that iconic branding really took place in this period. And it was heavily influenced by the automobile because people were traveling whenever they wanted. This is the Wheat State Motel sign at the Wheat State Motel. Then we have, sorry, the picture is so blurry. Drive-in theaters. So these theaters were created in response to the car, and their affordability and convenience made them a popular activity. There were approximately 25 drive-ins in 1945, but with post-war activities and disposable income, by 1950, there were over 2,000 drive-ins and over 4,000 6 years later. Most of the drive-ins in Kansas opened between 1948 and 1954 and were closed by the 1970s. Less than 10 drive-ins remain of the 99 across the state, and properties typically had a ticketing booth, concession stand, and screens, parking lot, and signage. This is the drive-in theater in my hometown in Lakeland, Florida, which still is a very busy place. So here's just some more across Kansas. There's only a few active ones, but we do have a lot of remnants. Roadside attractions. So parks and other locations provided scenic overlooks or areas to take a picnic or a short rest. And public lands were great recreational places, as well as amusement parks and putt-putt golf, which were popular attractions. So this is a picture of Boot Hill in Dodge City. It was a reconstruction of the original Boot Hill, which was on Front Street. That was demolished when the highway went through Dodge City. So this area was probably made most famous by the TV show Gunsmoke. So if you're familiar with that, you will probably know about Dodge City. Natural landscapes and historic cultural places also became locations to visit. The Council Grove site of the signing of the Santa Fe Trail Treaty and the Pawnee Rock and Larned was another popular motor tourist destination. One of those words will work. At this time, It was when items like the largest ball of twine in Cawker City, Kansas, or the Garden of Eden in Lucas brought in its tourists. So the Garden of Eden is one of the great destination places in Lucas, which is an artist community and has a lot of really funky things. Heritage parks are collections of historic buildings that have been often relocated onto a single property for purposes of tourism and attracting people to learn about historic buildings. And it also often saves them from being demolished. That's why they're usually relocated. The properties often display a more general history to show the context for that type of structure. There's some churches, barbershops, one-room schoolhouses, grocers, etc. Many of them are accessible to the public and contain period artifacts that help people learn about what life was like previously in these types of places, or just as a display option as well. And some of them even have living history with people dressed up and acting in period dress and sometimes using languages common to the area. This is Old Abilene Town, and it's a good example of this with its many structures and artifacts. They also have a historic carousel that they still use, which is a really impressive site. Here's some more of their buildings around the property. This is, I think, an old prairie town in Topeka. So these have become, I think, more common over the last couple of decades. We get questions about them all the time. People are still relocating buildings to these types of areas. So it's worth doing a broader context just on them alone. So signage is my favorite part. It became incredibly important as passerbys came at great speeds and further distances. Signage changed from a flat surface that attached to structures to their own standalone signs, physical structures, and they're often popularized with neon or electric lighting or marquees. Critics do not welcome the large and overwhelming displays of billboards or buildings, and they were often oversized. So signs changed to become larger, taller, and more flamboyant as a way to attract even more people. Both of the motels can be seen in the background, and you can see how different they are. The one on the left is a singular structure, whereas the one on the right has several separate buildings and it is a bit older, but they both have really great signs. And I'll end with the guest motel sign because I really like this one a lot. But I can talk about my research if you want, but if not, that's my last interesting fact.
Jamie, what could you say? We're a little bit ahead of time. Could you talk a bit about your research? That would be very interesting. Maybe 5 minutes or so.
Sure. So a few years ago in Kansas, we did a statewide architectural survey, and we created this quite large document called Roadside Kansas, and it covers roadside resources. So we did this architectural survey to see what existed, what conditions it was in, what were the variabilities, how we could evaluate them, see what changes were common or not common, and if anything was still standing. So we created this historic context that covers pretty much all of transportation history in Kansas, and then identifies these various types of resources. So it's actually a really great document. It has lots of, well, a lot of great information in it as well, but it covers hundreds, I think we did hundreds of buildings across the state. And they also used Rosen preservation. I think they're becoming more common or more well-known across the country. They've been working on developing other historic contexts nationwide. And our local historian, Dale Nims, they both worked on the survey and developing the project, as well as building the context and the resources. So we were able to have a lot of great documentation in our office. Our resources are available online. We have the Kansas Historic Resources Inventory, and it's an online database with all of our architectural records, and you can flip through them by type, style, age, keyword of any kind, location. It's a really great tool for researching, especially if you're looking at roadside resources, because we have so many documented and available. That was much faster than 5 minutes.
That's great though, Jamie. You're not looking at the comments, but while you were speaking, one of our viewers, Stephanie Stuckey, actually, who is reviving the Stuckey's chain of roadside establishments, asked the question, is this research available online? Where can I have a look at it? And while she was asking that, you were answering the question. So that's great. That's an excellent presentation, Jamie. One question about the research is, do you find when you're identifying these properties and the ones that as particularly are SCA type roadside diners, so on and so forth, is there any concentration of these along Route 66 in Kansas, or is it pretty generally distributed throughout the state?
I think there's a good number along Route 66. That's in southeastern Kansas, but we only have, I think, less than 20 miles that actually cut through the state. But historically, Kansas has always been a big transient state with trails going clear across all the time. I mean, it's smack dab in the middle of the country, so it makes a difference. But it's been popular for a long time, and there's a great distribution as you get further west, so it makes traveling a lot easier.
Right. Okay, that's great. We don't have any questions. I haven't looked at the chat recently. There may not be any particular questions, but I have a question, and now we're going to open it up to people who want to make a comment or ask you something. But one of the pictures you showed, well, first of all, I was very amused by the picture you had of the A&W, where on part of the signage it says pig and beef rather than pork and beef. It says pig. I've never seen that before in a restaurant. Not exactly designed to make me want to eat the pig, I don't think. But the other one was Uncle Tom's. There's one motel called Uncle Tom's, and of course that has a connotation. Can you speak a bit about the issue of the Green Book and that sort of thing in Kansas?
We are actually doing research on that right now. So we're trying to put that together and doing hopefully another statewide survey to help identify what places still exist. But right now we've been collecting the books and trying to get an idea of mostly from satellite images if there's anything still extant. And then soon we'll be doing a statewide survey where we'll really go out and look and find the resources and see what still remains. So it's African-American history has a really interesting context in Kansas, with the exodusters coming here, escaping the Civil War in the South. It's very complicated. So there's a lot of great resources. There's also a town called Nicodemus that was set up by African-American settlers, still exists, and I think is a national landmark. So there's a lot of great information on that available.
Oh, great. Now, I was lying when I said there's no questions. There's lots of questions here. So I'll go through them. Nicole Armstrong asked, Jamie, is the Chips restaurant shown in the restaurant part of your shown in the restaurant part of your presentation somewhere in Kansas?
I'll have to look at that picture again, but I can let you know because I labeled where all my pictures were while I was putting this together.
Okay. And by the way, for everybody who's watching and listening, Jamie gets a copy of the chat. So she'll be able to review the questions and also who is posing these questions. And she will get a copy of the viewers' emails too. So she can respond to those viewers that were like that one. Now, Jeremy Ebersole, who is working with the Milwaukee Preservation Association, asked, has the MPD resulted in more roadside places being listed on the National Register?
Yes, dramatically. We've listed, I think, maybe 4 in the last year. Usually the common ones are gas stations. We actually have someone working on an old Phillips 66 gas station in Phillipsburg, Phillips County, Kansas. That's going to be a fun one. But we do have restaurants and motels. Mostly we're finding that a lot of the diners aren't extant, but there are a few around. So we've been collecting those as well. But yes, it makes a huge difference on the context and allowing us to list those properties in the National Register.
That's great. Now, Stephanie, if you're still online, can you unmute yourself and come on? You had a question, not a question, but a comment about your original blue roof stuckies in Paxico. I hope I'm saying that right. Stephanie, are you there?
Yeah, actually, you said Paxico, right? But it's Stuckies, just like Stuckies. And sorry,
I'm sorry,
I
Stuckies.
came from working out, so I usually have video, but yeah, so there's only a handful of the original blue roof arch Stuckies and this is one of like 5 that you can actually see the ceiling when you walk in. It's absolutely beautiful. It needs some restoration. I've been haranguing the owner to see if he would cooperate with us, but in any event, just curious if that Stuckies is in your listing, and if not, would love to coordinate with you on maybe getting it listed.
I don't think it's listed, but I'm pretty sure my boss and I point it out every single time we drive by it. So if you want to email me, we can talk more about getting it listed and what that looks like. We also have a state and federal tax credit for people who rehab historic buildings. So that's an option too for funding or reimbursement anyway for the owners.
Excellent. Yeah, I will send that to you. And next time, don't drive by, stop.
Okay.
We'll meet up. We should do a road trip. I'll meet you there sometime.
Okay.
Now, Carol Jones asked a question, and she joined the presentation late. So she just was asking, was a filling station in Glen Elder, Kansas, included in your talk?
I will have to look. There were so many, I don't have them all memorized. I'm sorry.
Okay. Michael Stubbs asks, doesn't the Kansas Museum of History have a diner on display in the museum?
Yes, and neon signs from them as well.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Now, Greg Holmes says, unfortunately, the Dine Quick sign in your presentation in Wichita is gone. I don't know if that's news to you.
Okay.
Yeah, Greg, did you want to unmute yourself, Greg, and say anything about that? Oh, we can't hear you, Greg.
Yeah, yeah, it's been gone, I think, around 3 years. Unfortunately, the stretch in Wichita that's Broadway, Highway 81, was very rich in old signage as recently as the early 2000s, but it's really been decimated. So, and Dine Quick is one of the casualties of that. However, there's a great motel sign on 54 Kellogg Drive in Wichita. The Western Holiday Motel has a cowboy sign that's probably about 20 feet tall. And I've talked to the owners about getting the neon on it fixed. They discovered that if they took it down, we've all heard this kind of story, if they took it down and had it taken to a neon shop to be repaired, they would run afoul of the current zoning restrictions, which they're exempt from because it's grandfathered. But they take it down, they put it back up again. That's a problem. But yeah, Dine Quick's gone. What else is in Wichita? There's a Muffler Man on at Brown's Tire on South Broadway, Highway 81 in Wichita. Another thing some other people of our ilk might enjoy.
Oh, thanks very much, Greg. Brett, are you still online? You made a comment that said, I drove US 36 across Kansas this past summer, and what a great experience. Could you unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about it, if you're still here? Brett, are you with us? Oh, maybe he's gone. Okay, or he can join us a little bit later. Okay, I think that's it for the questions. Now let's open it up. If anybody would like to ask Jamie a question or a comment or just any general observations, here's your chance to do it.
I'm in Spokane, Washington, so enjoying your presentation.
Oh, that's Brett, right?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of interesting stuff here. Yeah, I drove US 36 last summer from St. Joseph, Missouri, all the way across the state. And it was a super neat experience. I really enjoyed Marysville, Kansas. My wife really got a kick out of that with the squirrels. Kind of a really cute idea for branding. And then we also stopped in Lebanon, and we also stopped at the Geographic Center of the United States.
Yeah.
So that was a cool experience. Again, I've actually been working with a few of the communities along the US 36 as a cartographer and doing chamber of commerce mapping and things like that. So I think I'll definitely reach out to you, Jamie, and see what else we can do in terms of interactive maps and other things for tourism and using roadside architecture. And I'll just add to one other piece here. There's several great books out there on hotels, motels, roadside restaurants and stuff by a fellow professor of mine at University of Illinois, Dr. John Jackal. Fabulous wealth of research on the Howard Johnson Exchange, Holiday Inn, all that kind of good stuff. So great stuff. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you.
Great. And John Jekyll, of course, is a member of the SCA, which I'm sure everybody's aware of that. Several people have written in and said, we would like the link to the research. Do you have it handy, Jamie, what the link to the research is? Or is there a website they can go to that has it?
Yes, if I stop screen sharing, is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I can pull that up. So we have all of our historic context on our website, which is very handy. And so here is the link to the document. Hopefully that. It's 129 pages. It's in PDF format, should be pretty easy to access.
Oh, I see. Okay, you've posted it on the chat there. So anybody that wants it, have a look at the chat, and you can probably cut and paste that actually right out of there, and then you'll have it, and you can check out that register and see what it's all about. Lots of good compliments here, Jamie, about your presentation. People have really enjoyed it, including myself. Found it very instructive, and the pictures are great. I got to say, you got some real gems in there. Any more questions or comments for Jamie? Just go crazy, everybody. Unmute yourself and let's hear it. Anything? Okay, well, it looks like we might actually meet our appointed stopping time for once. So that's actually a good thing. Jamie, I'd like to thank you again. It's a very excellent presentation. I know I enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else did. Jamie has been awarded a 1-year free membership in the SCA as a little thank you, a token of our appreciation. Everybody else is going to have to pay to join, and you will be getting your invitations in the mail this evening or perhaps tomorrow morning. The price of a membership is $55 for a year, and there's lots of good things that come out of that. Just want to remind everybody about next month's presentation, which is April 13th, another Wednesday at 8 Eastern, and that is going to be fascinating. A presentation by Frank Brusca about Jack Kerouac's travels, and he traces these through his book and photographs and people and so on and so forth. It's really something a little bit different and quite fascinating. And then I really would like to remind the Kansas viewers tonight that our June presentation, June 14th, Wednesday at 7 Central, is by Erica Nelson, who's a Kansas person, and she runs a very interesting museum in Lucas, which Jamie referred to, Lucas. I think that will also be an excellent presentation, and the Kansas Historical Society people will be getting a special invite to that presentation. This presentation tonight will be on the website probably by tomorrow morning. Our webmaster is very efficient. So you'll be able to watch it again. You'll be able to refer it to anybody else that you like. And I think that wraps it up for tonight. One last chance. Anybody else like to make a comment or say something to Jamie?
I have a trivia question for Jamie.
Go ahead.
My brother drove through Liberal, Kansas years and years ago, and he said he had some of the best pie in his life. But there's only about two. I've been through there several times because I do a lot of cross countries, but he couldn't remember where it was. So do you have any ideas?
I bet my boss would know because he knows every
specializes
place.
in really great pie. I think he said it was a pecan pie, but I'm not positive.
I'll find out.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, just before we go, I'll apologize for our technical problems in the first part of the meeting, but we're not going to have those anymore because I discovered I'm a bit of a neophyte at Zoom. There's a button on here. I can mute everybody by clicking one button. So that's what's going to happen next time we start the meeting. And then as people would like to speak, they can unmute themselves. But that'll take care of the interference and back sound that we had at the beginning. So again, any more going once, going twice, 3 times? Anybody else? No. Okay. Well, somebody spoke up.
I'll just say that I like the picture. It was about a third of the way through. There was a building there that it was actually a Quonset hut with a fancy front on it.
Yes. We have lots of Kwanzaa huts. They're wonderful. Most of our, well, not most of our images, but a lot of the images I used were actually, I will give credit to our state archives because they have an extensive digital image collection, which just is absolutely amazing. So if you want to look around on their website too, I encourage you.
A lot of the Quonset huts came from closed military installations after World War II, by the way, especially if they were close to one.
By the way, everyone, we had 115 participants in this presentation tonight, which is by far a record for an SCA presentation. I credit the quality of the presentation. I credit the participation by Kansas Historical Society members and other interested people from Kansas. But the popularity of these presentations is really growing. I think it's because the quality is the news about the quality is spreading. So join us next month as well for another really interesting one. And with that, I'd like to thank Jamie again. Thank you all for participating and bid you all good night.
Great job, Brian. Thanks so much.
Okay, goodbye.